Welcome to Raising Grace. I'm Sister John Dominic, a Dominican sister of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist, and I have with me Dr. Karen Villa. She will give you an introduction to herself in just a moment. But I have been working, as you may know, in Catholic education now for over 35 years, and then in religious life now for over 40.
That's amazing.
And in my work in Catholic schools, actually I served as a principal for like 20 years, that's where we got to know one another.
That's right.
And then also as a teacher for more than 15. So I have this deep love and passion, for Catholic education. And from that has come the work in Disciple of Christ, Education and Virtue, and developing resources for schools. But there's been a really a passionate topic that Dr. Karen Villa and I have been working on together. So I thought maybe if you can hear her background, and then maybe you'll be able to draw the conclusion and be like, oh, now I know why they're together.
Right.
So,
yeah, I'm so excited to be with you and your team here today to talk about Raised in Grace and Made for Wholeness. It's always interesting where history places you. So I was training to be a neuropsychologist, a clinical neuropsychologist in the decade of the brain. And there was this huge paradigm shift going on in the decade of the brain where a lot of our long-held notions were being challenged by the new neuroscience that was coming out of that decade. And it culminated in a field called interpersonal neurobiology. So I did a couple of postdocs, and then I was raising my children and starting my private practice. And I found myself really focused on interpersonal neurobiology and neurodevelopment. And that's when I met you, and you were starting your virtue education program. And we started to have this long conversation about interpersonal neurobiology and virtue. And we decided to put pen to paper last year and bring all these ideas together.
Bring it together. And then also, I have to ask you, though, this one question, though, since you studied it and then you raised your children. Right. Is that a little bit like what Dr. Dan Siegel did, who we read a lot, how he wrote his books as he wrote the children? But
so he's the father of interpersonal neurobiology, and he's a prolific researcher and just such an incredible scientist. So what he did while he was learning and developing interpersonal neurobiology and raising his own children, he translated these findings into a series of books for parents. And so many good ideas have come out of that, and they're so consistent with virtue education and wiring children's brains for good and for health. Exactly.
So that's kind of the synergy that we've kind of seen as we call it together, the synergy of interpersonal neurobiology and virtue education, which will be a part of what we're going to talk about in this series. But before we kind of dive into it, and I explained what we mean by Raised in Grace, Made for Wholeness, I would like to just frame everything in understanding Our Lady. There's one apparition here in the United States. It's the only approved Marian apparition, and it's north of Green Bay and Champion, Wisconsin. Now, the title used to be Our Lady of Good Help, but now it is Our Lady of Champion because it's named after the little bitty town there in Wisconsin,
interesting,
where the apparition took place. And so this is during the 1800s. And when she was talking to Sister Adele, was the one who she appeared to, she said, what I want you to do in this, and she talked about it as being a wild country. So now of course, it was probably the wilderness of Wisconsin, right?
We have our own wildness today.
Exactly. It's a different wild country. But the primary focus of really the apparition was to teach the children, all that they need to know for salvation. And one of the things that she asked them to focus on was really how to make the sign of the cross, to make a reverent sign of the cross, which is something that we've picked up on, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show, but just the importance and the beauty of making that sign of the cross and bringing as a way to kind of bring us together and understanding that relationship with Christ. So just kind of pray to her, really, as you're raising your children, as you're teaching children, And if you're actually in Wisconsin, just north of Green Bay, make a pilgrimage there. I've made several of them there.
Oh, my goodness. That's
and I've entrusted this work that we're doing with Raised in Grace, Made for Wholeness, to her care. So the title is something that we went back and forth with, like, how do you bring interpersonal neurobiology and virtue together? And Dr. Villa had said, well, why don't we, it's really what we want to do is like raised in grace,
Mm-hmm.
And when we understand what we mean in our Catholic faith about the word grace, grace is our participation in God's life,
Mm-hmm.
That he doesn't necessarily desire that we just have to go through life white knuckling things, and just live on this natural level, that
Mm-hmm.
he wants to be a part of that. He wants to be a part of our journey, of all that we go through. And it's his grace, which is his life, where he enters into that relationship so that we're in that relationship with him as we're going through. But also, which you'll understand and which we will unpack is really the relationships that we have with one another. So it's, love of God, and love of neighbor. And the other part is this, the made for wholeness. And the fragmentation, when we'll talk about this in the next episode about, why this was a needed study, but this wholeness that we're body, soul people, that we're not just these spirits walking around. And that's really where we come together with my understanding with the theology and the spirituality and your understanding with the brain. So why don't maybe you kind of say how you see this understanding with the body and the soul coming together. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the decade of the brain and all of the findings were his grace to us, because it's clear that we haven't been getting it right with children in a lot of ways. And I think children were the biggest beneficiaries of those findings from the decade of the brain. So he gave us this grace. And I think he's led you and I to bring this social emotional learning that's emerging in education. He led us to bring it under the umbrella of the baptism and the grace of baptism and the sacramental life. So we've put together this developmental timeline that reflects all of that, and we'll talk about it in a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think one thing, too, I like analogies, as you'll probably learn, but really, the end, if we kind of want to say, too, like, beginning this and to kind of show you with the end in mind, is that we're really looking to the integration, the human flourishing of the person, that the children can become the person that God's created them to be. We're body and soul, The body has the intellect and the soul has the intellect and the will, the body and the brain, and how all of this really comes together. But
if I can add, that's something that you and I talk about that is in our Raised in Grace book, that it's not just about brain development, because the brain has this two-way ongoing conversation with the body. And, what we're finding recently that's is this paradigm shift, is that we're moving from thinking about behavior not so much as noncompliance, but as a stress response that's first initiated in the body and kind of comes in from the bottom up. So it's very important to think about this mind-body soul connection.
Exactly, and that would be with the nervous system, just the whole part. So it's all of us,
it's
right?
All of us, and we can't split these things out anymore.
Right, exactly, and to bring it together.
Yeah.
So if we think, and remember that, because that's a really important analogy when I'm talking about the three images.
Yes.
So if we have, if you think of a healthy tree, like just look at a landscape, and you have a healthy tree. And this tree, which we would also make that correlation with the virtue tree, where you see at the roots are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. We have Christ at the center, and the virtues that go up with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The fruits and the birds and the animals and everything are just happy in that, know. And that's right. And that's the fully integrated person when we talk about the nurturing and the care that needs to take place. And that's this connection. So if we think about you talk about just the whole body working together, just like the sap running through the tree to give it life, which is the Holy Spirit, and God's love, giving
Yes.
it life.
And this environment that's giving this nourishment, it is the theological virtues.
Yes, and holding it in there.
Yeah.
And then right next to it, there could be another tree, just as when Jesus came up to the fig tree, and the fig tree went up to look, he was hungry, so he's looking for a fig, and there wasn't one there, And so he was a little upset. If you read it, it's kind of like, ooh, But he said, you're supposed to be, a fruit-bearing tree, and you're not. And so he went so far as to say, just cut it down. Another one of the Gospels, they come in and say, well, what happens if we just kind of nurture that, and to bring it back? So that would be just maybe it could just be with the virtues, how someone can live, but they're not this bearing fruit. And lastly would be a tree that maybe have some dead branches on it, or needs some pruning, or needs some work, or whatever it may be. So that soil to help bring life and to get that life, that sap running through it. Now, all three of those are going to be experiencing hardships and difficulties, that they have to weather throughout life, but how we respond to the elements or whatever may happen is going to be different. But it's those skills, it's all those things upon this timeline that we're talking about, this beauty of gradualness. And most importantly, those first 1,000 days, which Dr. Villa will talk about, and just give a little bit of a brief introduction, because I've asked her really to give us a really more thorough teaching of what we mean about those first 1,000 days. So I don't know if you want to give a little introduction before.
Yeah, sure. So our goal was to lay out a map of how to reach human flourishing. And of course, we want any parent, any teacher wants a child to reach their full potential. They want them to be that beautiful, lively tree. And so how do you move from seed to sapling to young tree to a strong oak that can weather the challenges of daily life and be resilient? Well, that's the idea we had in mind when we laid out our timeline. So besides bringing social emotional learning under this umbrella of sacramental living and under the grace of Christ, we've also anchored development in these windows of neurological opportunity where there's really intense growth. And the shadow side of that is that there's also intense vulnerability. But the first 1,000 days is from 0 to 2 years old. And we know that there is exponential brain growth going on in the context of loving, connected relationships with caregivers.
That's right.
And so there's a whole field of study about the first 1,000 days, and I'll be talking about that.
Yes, so I know that would be something that you that are watching would be very interested in, especially if you have grandchildren or little children. So I asked Dr. Villa really just to give us a really teaching on this, so that we'll begin and you can watch that now.
I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today about the first 1,000 days, because knowing, understanding, and telling others about the first 1,000 days is one of the greatest ways that we can care for God's children. So what are the first 1,000 days, and why are they so important? The first 1,000 days is a period from conception to 2 years old. Recent and ongoing research indicates that this is the highest time of developmental plasticity in any person's life, and much of human biological development is completed during this first 1,000 days. This capacity makes the human infant both versatile and vulnerable at the same time. Psalm 139, 13 through 14 says, "For you created me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." We now know that what God began knitting together in the womb continues beyond into those first 2 years of life and even through the mid-20s. Most organ systems are wired within the womb. However, the immune system, the brain, and the liver are the only systems to continue to be wired outside of the womb, especially in those first 2 years. So neuroplasticity tells us that experience is the architect of the mind. The growth of the brain occurs in what we call critical periods, or windows of development, where the effect of experiences on brain development is unusually profound and can strongly shape neural circuitry. It's evident that a child's interactions with their caregiver is perhaps the most powerful determinant of their future health and well-being. Every infant is born with approximately 100 billion neurons in their brain, and each of those neurons is forming numerous synaptic connections with other neurons. Here's an illustration about how much of that brain wiring is going on in those first 2 years. You see exponential growth and connectivity being wired in those first 1,000 days, but this wiring of connections comes from a caring, stimulating, and responsive environment, and the environment is the caregiver, the mother. Early nurturance from the mother sets up how a newborn's emotional, mental, and physical development will unfold. 97% of the energy that an infant takes in is going to their brain development. Science shows us that all aspects of brain development are peaking and developing before the child is 4 years old. As a matter of fact, research in neurodevelopment reveals that an infant's environment can increase or decrease their brain connectivity by up to 25%. And the more connections, the greater the brain's ability to process and learn in the future. If the pregnant mother is stressed and has high circulating levels of the stress hormone cortisol, that will of course affect the baby because they share the same blood supply. Heightened exposure to stress in the womb then leads to greater reactivity to stress after birth, as well as longer-term problems with emotional and cognitive functioning. We know in animal experiments when pregnant mice were given the smell of peppermint along with a mild electric shock, when then the baby mice were born, they were never given electric shock, but they would have a stress response to the smell of peppermint. And now we also know more about the fact that what happened to your parents or grandparents in their lifetime, and even before that, also has an effect on your neural wiring, a field called epigenetics. We don't inherit the genes that our parents were born with. We inherit the expression of their genes at the time of conception. Basically, positive early experiences build neuronal connection while adverse experiences disrupt neuronal architecture. The baby is wired to seek and find the face of its mother, her human voice, and her touch. And this is wiring the functioning of the baby's organs, their immune system, and their brain. Simple actions can trigger positive outcomes. Breastfeeding, singing, playing, reading, carrying our babies, touching, and even infant massage develop the brain and serve a protective function in long-term health and well-being. On the other hand, environments that carry excessive stress, conflict, lack of warmth, inadequate parenting, malnutrition, and poverty, even leaving an infant to cry it out, can all disrupt neurodevelopment, and even more can lead to unleashing the genetic potential for neurodevelopmental disorders. So what should we learn from this rapidly evolving neuroscience about the first 1,000 days? Well, the quality of parenting, though not needing to be perfect, should be responsive to negative emotional states and needs. An infant can't differentiate between physical pain and emotional pain, so their distress must be tended to in a consistent, caring, and timely manner. On the other hand, unreliable, unresponsive, and unpredictable responses to an infant's needs can lead to significantly disrupted neurodevelopment and insecure attachments. And qualities such as empathy and understanding, joy and playfulness, helping a child to feel good about themselves by being seen, and even lovingly helping them to tolerate boundaries will provide a lifelong protective foundation for well-being and success. What a great return on investment this is. Fathers, love and support the mothers of your children, and then go on to engage with your baby. Greater emotional involvement from fathers has been linked to many positive social, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive outcomes. Mothers, recognize the importance of your role. Seek the support of other mothers and have good self-care by avoiding alcohol or smoking and taking time to rest and get good nutrition, so that you can have the power to show up for your children by helping them to feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure. The idea is that the first 1,000 days of a child's life determine the next 32,000 days.
So as Dr. Villa had talked about, you can see that this is this time, this knitting together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where everything is coming together, and this is the foundational part, of these first 1,000 days. And one thing too, when we talked about this body and soul, and also just realizing just giving the children all that they need is that we just don't want to focus on just the skill building, okay? It's the skill building, but also it's the skill building, as I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about grace, where we're lifted up into, God's life, that He is with us, that we have this connection, And then when we talk about even understanding our emotions and our feelings, how virtue, kind of comes in and brings those into our life. Exactly. Right? Balances out and brings it together. And as I mentioned with the apparition, with Our Lady of Champions, she talked about the importance of teaching, children the sign of the cross, And the other thing we like to talk about is this understanding of a still point of grace. And that comes from the Carthusian motto, where the cross of Christ is still, okay, as the world turns.
As the world turns.
It almost sounds a little bit like an old soap opera in Days to Go, right?
But it is
the world is still turning.
Chaotic world for children today. And we do need to be still ourselves, and we need to, bring them into a state of stillness.
Yes. And so when we understand this, making this, this sign of the cross, an intentional sign of a cross, that's a way to bring us, to remind us of our baptism, this moment when we're brought into the life of God, brought into the life of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and to live from this point where we're recognizing that, that He is with us. And again, there's the difficulties that we all are going to encounter, and they're not going away, but when we walk with Christ and He's with us and strengthening us.
So all brain growth occurs in the context of attachment, and we're saying in the context of attachment to Christ as well as teachers and parents, that there's this idea that as adults, when we're in our still point, we help children to regulate themselves so that they can be open to their learning. And that's the idea of co-regulation that we'll talk about in some future episode.
We're baiting you along the way here to get to hear different things. But as you can see, it's all of this coming together. It's Dr. Villa's studies from this. This is all God's providence that we're here. Her studies in the neuroscience, raising her children, continuing her practice, which you still have today, meeting with people. My experience in Catholic education, working with children, theology, living the religious life, and finding how that we can bring this understanding all together to look at the child, to help you as parents, as educators, to understand this in a way that's accessible, we hope, and that we've done the hard work of, believe me, there's a lot of books that can be read.
Great. But I would add that one of our subtitle is The Beauty of Gradualness. And, kids are in such a hurry to grow up these days. Parents are in such a hurry to have them grow up. I think in education, we're rushing things too much, teaching them math concepts before they're ready for them. And the world is so chaotic and trying to get them to grow up so quickly. So the beauty of gradualness is about this idea of neuroplasticity, and that it's the small daily experiences over time that do provide that firm foundation and make that strong oak that's resilient to the challenges of life when they transition to young adulthood. And virtue education is part of that. These are the brain foundations, the small daily experiences and character education that makes for that resilience and health when they arrive to young adulthood.
And this is such a message of hope. I think that, some of you may be thinking there's so much going on, in the world and the culture. And then, when there's so much coming, how do I pick what to do? And I think the beauty
of what to listen to, right?
Exactly. It's like, what voice do I listen to?
Exactly.
And then when we, if you understand this beauty of the neuroplasticity, is that our brain is always is this opportunity of rewiring itself. That God doesn't just kind of like, you're not stuck,
Which we used to think.
We used to think we were stuck.
One of the huge paradigm shifts. It's now taken, 20 years to come into kind of everyday understanding.
So you see that, and this is the body. So our brain is not stuck, right? This neuroplasticity that it can be rewired. We know that our soul isn't, that we always have this opportunity of forgiveness. We have the opportunity of conversion, the opportunity constantly, day in and day out, living in God's grace, where He's renewing us and refreshing us and helping us to become whole, to become the person He's created us to be.
In His plan, and now we know it's in His design.
Everything.
So that's worth listening to, I think.
Exactly. So if you will continue, we're going to, the next time we come together, as we've talked in this thing, we've given you just a little taste of what's coming. You'll see that we have a timeline that we've developed, which we refer to as the beauty of gradualness. Dr. Villa gave you a wonderful understanding of the importance of those first 1,000 days, talked about the still point of grace. So maybe the next time you make your sign of the cross, you can think about that as a very intentional moment of thinking of your baptism, to calling upon each person of the Blessed Trinity to bless you in that moment of tenseness or whatever it may be. And then also seeing how all of these things come together. The body and the soul come together for wholeness, really wholeness or holiness.
Right.
Holiness is really becoming the person God has created us to be. So what we will do in the next episode is we're going to take a look at why this is a needed study, to kind of shine a light on some of the things that are out there and continue this message of hope, which is going to be the thread that's coming in and out of each show. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.